Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to the January webinar of the Task Force for American Democracy. I'm Mary Smith, Director of the Task Force and a past president of the American Bar Association. We are thrilled. Today we have CNN legal commentator Elie Honig, and this is a not to be missed webinar. Today you'll hear about take a deep dive on everything going on at the Department of Justice. And just in the last 10 days, there's been an extraordinary amount of activity. So just since the beginning of this year, we have the court proceedings for Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, the investigation against Fairman Fed Chair Jerome Powell, and the resignations of several DOJ attorneys in Minnesota. And I haven't even mentioned the Epstein files yet. It's enough to make our heads spin. Well, thankfully today we have the perfect person to break it all down for us. Now, the U.S. system of government relies on an independent system of justice, and this has been a clear policy since the 1980s. So today we'll take a deep dive and see, is the department still independent? Now, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Elie Honig. He is CNN's senior legal analyst. He previously worked for 14 years as a federal and state prosecutor. He provides commentary. You might have seen him all weekend on CNN relating to legal issues in the Department of Justice and major criminal trials, the Supreme Court. And he is a national best-selling author of two books. First, Hatchet Man, How Bill Barr Broke the Prosecutor's Code and Corrupted the Justice Department. That was in 2021. And his most recent book, is about independent counsels, and we'll talk about that later. So I could go on because Elie has had such a distinguished career and continues to do so, but we want to dive in because we have so much to talk about today. So welcome, Elie to the program.
Thank you for having me, Mary. I'm chuckling because I'm the oldest of three boys, and you left out the middle child. You left those were my first and third books. There's one in the middle. That's
Oh,
okay though. It's called Untouchable: How Powerful People Get Away with It. But my middle brother is used to that as well. You know, it's tough being the middle child. So, thank you for having me, though. It's good to be with this group. I know several of your members and board members, and honored to talk to you.
well, I wanted to just kind of set the table about how does the Department of Justice normally operate? It's part of the executive branch. The president appoints the attorney general, but there is always been an independence to the department. And can you explain how that normally works? Because I want to kind of set the table to see if it's operating differently now.
So the gold standard is that the Justice Department is and should be independent. But let's dig in a little bit to what that means. Independent in what ways and independent from what and from whom, right? I've always sort of drawn the line as follows. There is no problem historically or ethically or politically, I don't think, with DOJ carrying out and enforcing the policy priorities and initiatives of a new government. So, for example, I was at DOJ for about 4 years under the last 4 years of George W. Bush, the first 4 years under Barack Obama. When that transition happened in 2009, some things became lower priorities and other things became higher priorities, right? So there's no problem with a president saying, I want to really focus more on combating human trafficking or less on regulating state and local police departments or, fill in the blank. And then DOJ doing that. That is normal, that is okay, that is acceptable. Where I think we traditionally draw the line is in the president or anyone outside of the Justice Department trying to influence its individual criminal investigative and prosecutorial decisions. I want you to investigate this guy. Please lay off that guy, etc. This is important to note. I was indoctrinated with the best of them at my time at the SDNY. I was both indoctrinatee originally, and later I became indoctrinator in the independence of the Justice Department. I mean, I used to, teach some of our internal classes, and I'm very much of a DOJ purist and a believer. However, when you're at DOJ, you're in something of a bubble. And it's part of why it's a great job, because you're focused only on the cases before you and doing, as we always say, tiresomely maybe, doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. But when you step out of that bubble, as I am now, and especially when you're in the context of the broader public world, political world, the media world, you realize that DOJ's independence is not a given. It's not stated in the Constitution DOJ shall be independent. There's no law saying DOJ shall be independent. It is part of the executive branch. And there is a valid school of thought. I disagree with it personally, but it's not a ridiculous thought, sometimes sort of shorthanded as the unitary executive theory, that the president isn't just the head of the executive branch, he is the executive branch, and therefore all the levers of executive power are there for him to pull. Now, very few I mean, part of my book is I really go back to investigations of the president back to Watergate and so everything from Nixon on. But what we are, so this notion of DOJ's independence is not enshrined in any specific document. Rather, it is the result and the product of decades and generations worth of tradition, practice, norms, and people, right? But it's delicate because you get different people in there who don't share those traditions and norms. And as we're seeing right now, that can be changed fundamentally. And as I think you and I will get to, Mary, what is happening now at DOJ is, and again, I have a little bit of perspective having done the book, it is not just different in degree, it is different in kind. It is a break in history from at least, I'll speak at least to Nick, from the 70s on through now.
Well, we are going to talk about a lot of different recent topics and then things that have happened over the last year, but I'll just kind of ask you point blank right now. Do you think this Department of Justice is still independent?
No. I mean, I want to give you a more of a lawyerly hedge, but no, look, we've had a year of experience here. I mean, the first thing, I'm not particularly partisan. I mean, you can see this in my analysis. I personally don't happen to be strongly right or left. I try to look at each individual issue as it comes up. I was strongly critical of some of the Trump prosecutions of Donald Trump. I thought some of them were outrageous and abuses of power and proved out to be correct. And liberals didn't like that, but I'm also not afraid to I wrote a book criticizing Bill Barr. I routinely criticize Donald Trump. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times the day of Pam Bondi's confirmation hearing in the Senate. And I basically said, on paper, this is a qualified attorney general. In fact, on paper, I guess maybe ironically, as it turns out, the person whose resume Pam Bondi most resembles is Janet Reno. I mean, they both came up as state-level Florida prosecutors and came in to be attorney general from there. Now, the similarities pretty much end at that point, we've now learned. Janet Reno, who was fiercely independent and probably the AG I most admire over our history. She's not perfect, but for her independence. But the point of my New York Times op-ed was, let's give Pam Bondi a chance. Look, there's no question about her competency, although some have arisen since then. But there is a question about whether she'll be independent because she's a Trump loyalist. She had vouched for 2020 election fraud theories that were false. But let's see. And the moment when I said, oh, okay, we've got a different ballgame here was when the Signal scandal happened, when Mike Waltz and all these guys were using Signal to discuss military plans. Ordinarily, any case involving that type of mishandling of sensitive information would at a minimum result in a substantial investigation, whether you're talking about Hillary Clinton's email server, Joe Biden having documents in his garage, Donald Trump having documents at Mar-a-Lago. At a minimum, you have a robust investigation or even a special counsel. You have indictments. What did Donald Trump get indicted? One of the indictments for? Pam Bondi came out within hours, maybe day or two, and said, nothing to see here. We're not investigating. And you all should be applauding the success of this military strike. And I thought, oh, okay, now I see where we stand. And there's been other examples since, but just the most recent one is Todd Blanche, Deputy AG. And I should say, I grew up at the SDNY with Todd. I started there in 2004. I think he started in 2005 or 2006. We were raised by the same people in the same building at the same time. And he knows better, but he came out yesterday and declared, with no investigation having been done or minimal, that there was not even a basis to investigate whether the ICE officers' actions were legally justified or not, whether there should be any criminal charges against that agent. And so what they're doing now is it's end result as dictated by the president or politics first, and then you backfill in your analysis. So I would like to hedge that answer some, but I can't. I just think we've seen a substantial change in the way DOJ operates.
Yeah. And well, you've already mentioned it, the killing last week of Renee Good in Minnesota, and the fact that DOJ is not going to even investigate, let alone bring charges against the ICE officer. We now almost probably everyone watching has probably seen all the videos. There's several of them from different angles. What are your thoughts on it?
I think I've said this on air, on radio. Look, I was involved in reviewing a lot of police shootings after my DOJ time. I went over to the state of New Jersey, and one of my responsibilities was overseeing from a distance these police shooting cases. My gut reaction watching those videos the first time through was to use the lingo we would use in this area: bad shoot, right? Excessive force, not quite at the level that you would need for justification, reasonable belief of imminent death or bodily injury. It's a close call, though, to me. And I think anyone who declares conclusively, as we've seen on the one side from Todd Blanche and others, as we've seen on the other side from some Democrats, oh, this is murder. I think we need a full investigation. I still think I'm slightly on the bad shoot, but I do want to say this. There is an important difference between did the cop, I'll just say the cop as shorthand, but the ICE agent did things wrong, even violated policy, and murder. There is some liminal space between those two things. It's not like, well, the guidebook says you should never walk in front of a moving vehicle, and he did, hence murder. That does not follow, right? It's hence he did something wrong, and hence we can figure that in the overall calculus. So I'm still pretty close to the straddling the fence here. I can see this one either way, and I think it requires nuance. I can articulate it both ways. I mean, I'll just give you the glib articulations both ways. On the bad shoot side, you would say this was a slow impact bumper tap, and you don't get 3 shots to the head because of a slow, low impact bumper tap. On the other hand, it is true to say Renee Good's car was generally pointed in his direction. She accelerated, not at a massive rate of speed, but she accelerated. It did make contact with him, and had the wheel been a couple degrees, instead of like this, had it been like this, it would have hit him much more squarely on. And, who knows? You can get pretty badly injured by a moving car at 5 miles an hour. I mean, I know someone who was run over by a car at 5 miles an hour. So again, I think it's a close call, and I think there's nuance of it. What I think is not ambiguous is that as we alluded to, the fact that the president, the VP, Christine Oman, now Todd Blanche, all came out, and I wrote my current New York Magazine pieces about how this investigation was hopelessly tarnished from the get-go by these comments. These public comments are outrageous. All they should be saying is, let's investigate and then we'll figure it out. But to come out within hours and say, it's all good. I mean, there was never any hope from that moment that we would have a full independent investigation.
Yeah, and then we heard yesterday that they're not going to investigate the ICE officer, but they want to investigate Becca Good, Renee
Right.
Good, widow. And then we heard that at least 6 prosecutors in Minnesota have resigned over that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when 6 prosecutors resign from an office of 70 total, about that's 10% of the office. I mean, look, people don't resign from DOJ casually, in obvious protest. You leave when you're ready. When 6 go at once, including the number 2 person, these are career professionals. When we talk about the Justice Department, we tend to focus on the AG and the deputy AG and maybe the U.S. attorneys. They're all political appointees. It doesn't mean they're politically biased, but they are they are the result of the political process. But 99 point something percent of the people who work there, like I was, are just career prosecutors. And the beauty of being at DOJ is politics don't matter. I mean, I joke with Preet Bharara came in as my U.S. attorney after Obama won in 2009, and Preet's still a good friend of mine. And I joke with him, but it's true. I say, Preet, I don't even remember you starting. Like nothing changed, I guess we changed the name, on the bottom of the indictments, but I mean that as a compliment to him and to what DOJ was. So when 6, and by the way, it's not like this is the first time we've seen this. We had resignations out of my old office, the SDNY, over the mishandling of the Eric Adams case. We had resignations or people forced out in Eastern District of Virginia over the Comey and Letitia James prosecutions. We've had people fired because they worked on Jack Smith's case. We've had people fired because they worked on January 6th cases. So it's not like this is new. I understand why it's easier said than done. Like I've read pieces where people said, "Oh, everyone at DOJ should resign if they don't agree." Easier said than done. People have mortgages and kids, but when somebody does resign like that out of protest, out of principle, I applaud them, and I applaud these six prosecutors.
Yeah. Well, you've mentioned a lot of the situations where we've seen resignations over the last year. Let me ask you a couple questions. One, have we seen the volume of resignations that we've seen over the last year historically,
Oh,
or is this an anomaly? And then two, like they've all come very piecemeal, but do you have a sense of how many lawyers have left the Department of Justice just in the last year?
I don't have data on that latter point, but I will tell you anecdotally. I mean, I still know plenty of people there and plenty of people who've recently been there. Um, there are more vacancies. There's much more outflow and less inflow now than there's been in a long time. Have we seen, and I'll just consider sort of these protest resignations. The only other time that I can recall seeing them, certainly in the 8 years I've been involved in media, and I guess I can include my own time, in the 20 some years where I've either been at DOJ or covering DOJ, the only other time I've seen a sort of sequence of mass resignations was during Trump 1. You saw people resigning over Bill Barr's meddling with the Roger Stone and Michael Flynn cases. There were people who resigned over the John Durham probe, his number two person. So, but no, I mean, I certainly may be missing something, but I can't think of a time when DOJ prosecutors resigned in protest during any other modern administration. Never mind a series of, four, five, six, eight, whatever it is, prosecutors leaving at once for an obvious reason.
Yeah, and with respect to Trump one, I think the volume was much smaller than
I
what
think
we've
so.
seen over the last year. Yeah, and to me, it seems like you said, people don't resign lightly. It seems like that should be a flashing red flag
Yeah.
to the public. I hope that you see these resignations. Well, there's lots to get to. Just yesterday, again, we saw that now Department of Justice is investigating Fed Chair Jerome Powell. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting to see the reactions that have come from the right and from Republicans on this. I mean, this seems to be a point where you're hearing a lot of like even Republicans are saying, "Hold on, this is too much." I mean, look, the speculation used to be, ooh, when you would see a controversial investigation or prosecution of a political figure, a politics adjacent figure, we would go, oh, is there some involvement? Is there some foul play here? Is there some communication with the White House? Now Donald Trump posts about it. I mean, his Truth Social, September 20th said, I'm paraphrasing, we've all seen it, but when the heck are you going to prosecute Comey and Letitia James and Schiff? And two of the three have been indicted and now dismissed. And the other one is under investigation. And there's no bones about it. And yesterday Trump was asked, and spokespeople were asked, did Trump order this investigation of Jay Powell? And everyone denied it. I don't know if that's true or not, but he doesn't need to announce it. The people who are running DOJ, whether it's Pam Bondi, Jeannie Pirro in DC, whatever the technical title is right now for Alina Habba and Lindsay Halligan, Todd Blanchett, and deputy, they know their marching orders. They know who they're there to go. Ed Martin, they know who they're there to go after. There seems to be no basis for this investigation of the Fed chair perjury. I'd be stunned if Jerome Powell made a knowingly false misstatement to Congress on a material matter. But I think it's completely bogus. And what's interesting, I think there's two reasons we're seeing some pushback now from the right side. One, I think the notion of an independent Fed is not really a partisan notion. I think everyone's pretty much on board with that being a necessity. And two is these payback prosecutions. And by the way, I've been a sharp critic of Letitia James and Jim Comey. Jim Comey comes off horribly in my book. I mean, he's one of the villains of my book. I don't know either of them personally. I've met Comey a couple times, but I just missed him at the SDNY. He left and I started a few months later. Um, so I'm not at all fan or apologist for Letitia James or Jim Comey, but I thought the prosecutions of them were outrageous. And The thing is, they're failing in embarrassing ways. I mean, we've now had a judge throw out both indictments, and we've had grand juries reject twice efforts to re-indict Letitia James. And I don't think these cases will ever come to fruition. And I think that there comes a point when politically, if you're affiliated with this, you have to just think like enough's enough. This is not helping the American public or the American people or even Trump supporters. There was a poll by I want to say Marquette, I may have that wrong, but a couple weeks ago that showed that 48% of Republicans want Trump to stop these payback prosecutions. So okay, all Democrats want it to stop. I mean, it's not 100%, but some massive, but when 48% of your own party is saying this is a losing effort, um, we'll see. We'll see uh, if that point gets through at some point or not.
Yeah. And then it's interesting that this investigation started because there's a case pending at the Supreme Court as to whether the president can fire
Right, Lisa Cook.
yeah, Lisa Cook on the Federal Reserve. How do you think that case is going to come out?
Here's my read on it. So the harder question is, can the president remove a Fed board member for only for good cause, as the statute says, or for any cause he wants, right? The president has won a series of these. He's going to win the FTC case, right? Saying that even though Congress limits the way he can get rid of the members of these independent agencies, quasi-independent agencies, those statutes are invalid because they violate separation of powers because whether it's Merit Systems Protection Board or NLRB or FTC, those are within the executive branch. President can get rid of those folks for whatever reason he wants. However, the court has gone out of its way to say the Fed is different. But I think the Supreme Court can avoid even reaching that dicey question if they find that Donald Trump's determination that there was cause, if they uphold that. In other words,
Oh,
right? So if the ruling comes down from the Supreme Court, the first thing they're going to have to deal with is, was there cause or not, right? Or they can avoid let me say that again. They can avoid the tricky constitutional question if they find, look, there's an investigation of Lisa Cook for mortgage fraud. There's at least documents that there's some tension in things that she represented. Sitting here today, you don't know, I don't know, did she commit a crime or not? Who knows? But there's enough there that we're not going to overturn the president's determination of there being good cause. And if that's their ruling, you're done. You don't have to get to the tricky question of under what circumstances, can he remove the Fed chair, because the current law says for cause. So if they say we're not going to mess with his determination of cause, then you avoid the second question.
yeah, that's interesting though, because the signals that they have sent out through preliminary rulings, as I understand it, and you probably know better than me, the language for all these
Yeah.
independent agencies are very similar.
Well,
But
but they
yet,
also said they made a point in one of them, I forget which one, of
yes,
saying, but the Fed is
arbitration.
different. So like
Yeah,
heads up. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm wondering how the Supreme Court will distinguish that if the language in the statutes is similar, and if
Yeah.
they go the route that you suggest, where they accept as fact the president's determination that there really is cause to
Yeah.
fire, then they would allow the firing of the chair.
Right. Or not even accept as fact. They don't have to say we think Trump's right or he's got it or it's true. They might just say, who are we? We're in robes here in the Supreme Court building. He's the head of the executive branch. He's the one who made the determination. And one of the determinations that was made in one of the lower courts was, well, it only applies to conduct good cause, only applies to conduct while on the job or impacting the job. I don't know that that's going to stand up legally. I mean, it's an allegation of mortgage fraud for a person who, a financial fraud for a person who's given enormous financial power. I just think that that's an easy out for the Supreme Court if they want it to say, we're not upsetting that ruling.
Well, moving on, because there's so
Yep.
much to discuss, but since January 3rd, we saw the uh, case pending now against former Venezuelan President Maduro. So what can we expect in that case?
Well, let me just tell you, this was the perfect harbinger of what my 2026 would be like because on Saturday morning, January 3rd. Now, I never sleep past 6 a.m., like 6:15 maybe, if I'm splurging. But this was like the end of New Year's week. It was a Saturday morning. I had been on air the previous night until 11 p.m., got home at midnight. So I was dead asleep at 7:45, which never happens on a Saturday. And my phone rings and I go, what? And they go, we need you. How quick can you get up? What? And I said, what's happening? I thought, did someone die or something? And they said, Nicolas Maduro. And I said, why would that be me? That's like global politics and military and diplomacy and stuff. Get Christian Amanpour. That's not me. And they said, no, he's been indicted. He had been indicted. I didn't know this until, but and from there it was just, I don't think I've breathed since. And by the way, the crazy thing is that was an all-encompassing story that Saturday, Sunday, Monday. His initial appearance was Monday, and the next conference is in March, and it's still, but like we've forgotten about that. I mean, there's nothing really new to report at the moment, but it's been superseded many times over by all these other stuff. Look, it's the indictment. There's two things. Maduro's team is going to make all what I would call the scholarly arguments that he was arrested in violation of international law, that it invades foreign sovereignty. Similar argument. We don't have a lot of case law on this, but similar arguments were made in the Manuel Noriega case, and they failed. And there is actually a surprising amount of law, including from the Supreme Court, saying, well, even if a foreign national is taken illegally, there's a case we abducted somebody basically in Mexico in the 60s or something. That doesn't mean their U.S. indictment gets dismissed. So I think he's going to make those arguments. He's going to lose. Also, just as a practical matter, I don't see any. I know Alvin Hellerstein. I tried 3 cases in front of him, the judge. I don't see any judge on the planet who's going to go, yeah, you're right. Indictment dismissed. You're free to go. I just think that's really hard to do. Then there's the question of the indictment itself. We don't know a lot about the strength of the evidence. We know that the charges are really serious. Narco-terrorism, importation of thousands of tons of cocaine. There's sort of vaguely explained machine gun and bomb charges. So we know the charges are very serious, but sometimes when you see an indictment, it will tell you that the evidence is really strong. You don't have to itemize your evidence in an indictment, but sometimes you'll see an indictment will go, in a text exchange on such and such a date, the defendant wrote, quote, blah, 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 blah. The defendant, made the following confession to law enforcement agents, what have you. There's no reference to any specific piece of evidence. I think this is going to be a case built largely on the testimony of mid-level cooperating witnesses. There's good indicators that other people in this network have cooperated, and cooperator cases can always be defended. Look, I think the overwhelming likelihood is that he gets convicted at trial, but we're going to have to deal with a lot of sort of weighty international law issues before we even get to that point. And by the way, I should say, bigger picture, I do think, I wrote about this also for New York Magazine, I think it's the right decision. I'm not going to, I have no opinion. I don't know enough about global politics to know whether it was smart to pull him out or not. Once we did that, I think it's the right move to give him a civilian criminal trial, as opposed to holding him at Guantanamo or in some sort of military, because here we are with KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, 25 years later, still unresolved in Guantanamo. So I am a believer in our civilian criminal courts for this kind of case.
Well, you mentioned, the length of time and still pending cases in Guantanamo. Given that he's in civilian court in New York, when do you think this would actually go to trial? How long will it take to get to that point?
Judge Hellerstein is 92 years old. I mean, when I was trying cases in front of him, he was in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, and he's sharp, mentally sharp. Frankly, I wrote this in a piece for New York Magazine. He's not the most intellectual of judges. I got him reversed on a ridiculously straightforward proposition of law in the Second Circuit when I was a second year at AUSA. He's tough. He knows how to run his courtroom. Jeffrey Toobin wrote, I think, a persuasive column for the New York Times arguing that Judge Hellerstein should recuse himself. At age 92, what if he falls asleep during a trial? There's reporting that during the most recent trial he fell asleep a couple times on the bench. Like, the world's going to be watching this, and we can't have it look like somebody who's way past his prime is presiding over this case. But Judge Hellerstein, that first appearance was on January, I want to say 5th. He set a next conference for March 17th. You can tell right away, like, that's not an expedited pace. And he needs to move this thing. I mean, if I was the chief judge of the SDNY, which I decidedly am not, I would probably try to find a way to have a diplomatic conversation with him about, you're 92, I don't want to say too much, but he's had health issues recently. He's okay now, but he's 92 years old. He's had a great run. He's been senior status since 2011. So he's
Oh,
been senior for 15 years. And this case can't linger for 2.5 years. So I think the early indications from Judge Hellerstein is that he's not got his foot on the accelerator. And I think that's a problem.
well, moving on to other topics, the Epstein files, which have gotten pushed out of the news because of, you know, killing in Minnesota, Maduro, and the Fed chair. But Congress actually passed a law at the end of the year, and I find it kind of just ironic in a way that this is
Yeah.
one of the few bipartisan things that has happened in this Congress was the
Yeah.
Epstein files law. But DOJ was supposed to produce all the documents pursuant to a law at the end of last year, and they still haven't done so.
Yeah.
Is DOJ is basically flouting that law, right?
The law has passed on November 19th. Donald Trump signs it, and it says DOJ shall, not may, or what, shall produce all documents, not some, not the beginning of a rolling production, within 30 days, December 19th. And when it came time for December 19th, the example that I used in one of my columns was there's a scene in Fast Times at Ridgemont High where Jeff Spicoli, Sean Penn's character, plays this stoner high school kid, shows up late for class, and the stern professor says, "Why are you late?" And Spicoli famously says, "Just couldn't make it on time." And DOJ essentially got to their deadline and channeled Jeff Spicoli and said, "Just couldn't make it on time." Now, I don't know when the law became optional for the Justice Department, and the arrogance of them just thinking that they could just show up on December 19th and say, "We're starting today and we're working our hardest." But and then they said, Todd Blanche said, "We'll be done within 2 weeks, December 19th." Here we are a month out, and now the
Yeah.
latest is they've turned over some minuscule percentage, 5%, 10% of the entire document production. Now, look, I think there's valid criticisms of that law. That law goes against everything DOJ would normally do. We would never open up our files to mass public discovery because there's a high public interest. And you're right that the vote in Congress was almost unanimous. It was 427-1 in the House. It was unanimous in the Senate. But I will also, and signed by the president, I will also say it was disingenuous on all sides. Like, Democrats don't care about this. Democrats didn't care for 4 years. Democrats could have turned these files over if they wanted for 4 years. And when they saw a chance to kick around Donald Trump, they got interested again. Republicans outright were opposing this. Donald Trump was trying to lobby members of Congress to vote against this days before it. And then when they saw that it was not going to, it was going to pass, everyone pretended to care and voted for it. And now no one seems to care or really be enforcing anything, given that DOJ is not going to come anywhere near meeting this deadline. So these documents are going to continue to dribble out. And, yeah, there's been a lot of other things happening. And as much as, for a while, for the first few days, every time there was a document dump, I'd be rushed onto air and what's in this one and what does this mean? Now they're just all sort of accumulating. We don't know where they are in terms of the overall production. They don't seem to know where they are. And it will drag on this way. And there's, I don't know what anyone can do. Some members of Congress said they can call in the AG and browbeat her or Todd Blanche, but like, what's a judge going to do? Say, I order you to, it's a law. They already are supposed to comply.
Yeah, well, on a related note on the Epstein files, I know Congress wants to bring in the Clintons and they've
Hmm.
subpoenaed them to testify. And I saw just, I think it was yesterday, this extraordinary statement from Bill and Hillary Clinton, and I'm going to quote it
Yeah.
and get your reaction to it. It says, "Every person has to decide when they have seen or had enough and are ready to fight for this country, its principles, and its people, no matter the consequences." And they said, for us, now is that time. So they're not going to testify. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm looking at my book. Hold on. I'm looking in the index because there's a term I want to look up. Clintonian. There we are. Okay. So the term Clintonian now appears both in the Oxford English Dictionary and the Urban Dictionary.
Mm.
And it means The Oxford English Dictionary defines Clinton-esque as anything of or relating to Bill or Hillary Clinton, or as a claim that is true in most respects but deliberately misleading in certain particulars. The Urban Dictionary defines a Clintonian statement as one that, quote, typically skirts the issue or spins words. Perfect for what that statement is that you just read me. This isn't about fighting back against the reason the Clintons got subpoenaed is because of Bill Clinton's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Look at those photos, folks. Bill Clinton is in a hot tub with Ghislaine. There's two photos. One of them is he's in a pool at night with Ghislaine Maxwell and a woman whose identity is blacked out. Is she underage or not? We don't know. There's another one of him just in a hot tub with a girl whose identity is blacked out. I'm not saying he committed a crime, but if people believe Donald Trump needs to provide answers, then Bill Clinton sure as heck does too. The subpoena they were given was not just bipartisan, unanimous. All Democrats and all Republicans on that committee issued a subpoena 5 months ago in August. Now, look, there's an argument that that subpoena should be quashed. Okay, I get that. But the Clintons have not gone to court to make that argument in 5 months. They've had this back and forth, lawyer letters going both ways, the committee, and now they've set themselves up, the Clintons, for contempt. Because now what do we have? We have a valid subpoena. We have the testimony dates come and gone. We have no shows by both witnesses. And we have no finding from a court saying those subpoenas are invalid. And so if the House wants to go ahead and hold them in contempt, they can. And then it'll get sent over to DOJ. DOJ will decide whether to prosecute. I don't think the Clintons are going to jail or anything. But for people who cheered when Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon were held in contempt for defying congressional subpoenas and were prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned, the cases aren't quite the same, but they're not that different. And I think there's a hubris in this by the Clintons in thinking they could just blow this off and send a sort of beside the point, self-righteous missive like the one you just read, a Clinton-esque statement, and wrap themselves in the flag of righteousness. They got subpoenaed unanimously by this committee to answer questions about what Bill Clinton knows about Jeffrey Epstein. And if you think it's cool to ask Donald Trump questions like that, or name your person, Larry Summers or Bill Gates or whoever has been associated with Jeffrey Epstein, then Bill Clinton's no different. And if you think it's okay to defy a unanimous bipartisan subpoena and to just no-show, then you're aligned with the Clintons. But I think they're in the wrong here. I think there's a fair argument that the subpoenas should be quashed, but go ahead and make it to a judge and do it before the deadline. So that's my view.
Well, we've gotten a couple questions from the audience, and one relates to the Maduro case. Said, can Mexico indict and enter the U.S. with its military to arrest the U.S. president for gun running due to the U.S. failure to control and even promote the proliferation of guns?
I think that's a bit of a rhetorical question. The answer is no. And look, I mean, you know, the law is not even-handed on this. Our law allows our authorities to do things that we would never allow other countries to do to us, right? Again, there was that case where years ago, decades ago, where we forcibly kidnapped a Mexican national in Mexico and brought him to the United States. The Supreme Court said, not that's okay, but the case doesn't get dismissed. So no, that does not work both ways. I get the point.
Yeah, I want to get to kind of just some broader issues. Over the last year, we've seen a lot of immigration cases and people deported without due process. Can you talk about, there's a question in the Q&A about the lack of due process as well. Isn't that like a fundamental pillar of our system of justice, and how can
yes, and I
ignore it?
I think the Trump administration has vastly overstepped on this. They even got corrected by the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Early on in the March-April timeframe, when there was all these deportations under the Alien Enemies Act, and Kilmar Abrego Garcia was erroneously deported to, I think it was Honduras or El Salvador, I want to say. There were this whole series of court rulings, and you saw district and federal appellate judges of, both, who had been nominated by both parties, who were excoriating this. There was a a judge, there were Reagan appointed judges and Bush appointed judges. Ultimately, one of those cases reaches the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court makes a point of saying, while of course the feds have broad latitude over immigration enforcement, of course they can deport people who are here illegally, there always is a modicum of due process. Now, look, when you're in the immigration system, you don't get the same level of due process that a criminal defendant would get, but you do get a chance to argue, I'm not that person, I'm here legally, I have some sort of withholding order, and that was being abused. And I think the courts did their job in saying, there, including the conservatives on the Supreme Court, there has to be at least some minimal due process given. You can't just grab people and throw them out. They have to be given a chance, a reasonable chance, including a certain amount of time to retain a lawyer to contest this. Now, look, if you are here illegally, you can be deported. Like, there's no question about that. But even then, you are entitled to some level of due process.
Mhm. Well, and is the Department of Justice and the executive branch abiding by that? Because I read this, and you've probably seen it as well, an analysis by the Washington Post about how many court orders the administration has not abided by.
Right.
And I think we're seeing that at the district court level, the trial court level, and the appellate court level. But I think, to my knowledge, I don't think we've seen it at the Supreme Court level. But then on the other hand, I
Right.
think there's been 15 emergency appeals to the Supreme Court, and all of them were pretty much, at least preliminarily, resolved in favor of
Yeah.
the president.
This administration has a habit of going right up to that line and maybe dipping a toe over the line, most notably with the Alien Enemies Act cases. And, the plane was in the air when the order was issued and they couldn't, they played games. They played cute with that. Um, there are, however, it is not uncommon to have a judge issue an order and then the parties disputing, no, the order means this. No, you have to do that. No, it doesn't mean this. I mean, that I think we've gotten a little casual about calling that defiance. That's not really defiance. That's standard litigation. But yes, this administration has come closer to defiant, arguably has defied Judge Boasberg and that kind of thing early on. But I will say it's also worth noting, and I don't think the administration deserves brownie points for this, but the courts have held their own. I mean, the reason there is not National Guard on the streets of Chicago right now is because the courts struck that down. And
Mhm.
I don't agree with the characterization of Donald Trump as a dictator, because does a dictator who wants to deploy the military and then gets told by the courts, you can't do that? Does a dictator say, you're right, okay, fine, I don't like it, but now you're pulled, right? I'm not saying Trump's a hero for doing this. I'm not saying he's admirable. I'm saying, you know, Trump wants to see Jim Comey and Letitia James behind bars. Well, guess what? A district judge dismissed those cases. And Trump hasn't gone and locked them up. Again, I'm not saying he's a hero, but the courts and the guardrails are not perfect, but they are largely holding against some of the Trump administration's abuses. I think we'll probably see his tariffs struck down when that opinion drops. I think we will probably see him lose on birthright citizenship when that comes around. So the courts are largely, I'm certainly not saying the courts have been perfect, but they are drawing lines, and the administration, the record's not great, but a lot of the excesses have been remedied by court decisions.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the legal profession and how lawyers have reacted. We know that 9 law firms have entered into settlements with the
Yeah.
administration, promising almost 1 billion in pro bono services. And the thing about it is that only one of those firms actually was targeted by an executive order. So some firms have decided to fight, but others haven't. What do you think about how the legal profession as a whole has reacted?
Boy, this is a story that's also really receded. I think that Donald Trump's targeting of those law firms and the universities, but we'll focus on the law firms, was an attack on this profession. I think
Mhm.
the firms that decided to settle, they did it for the bottom line. There's no question they did it for the bottom line, but I think they uh, will ultimately be shamed for that. I think they should be. I don't think there's any justification of it. I did a bar panel and we were talking about this, and somebody said, "Yeah, but look, these are firms, these are private corporations. They have to make payroll and all that." And I said, "Yeah, but we're not making widgets here. This is a profession with ethics and norms and standards. And we have principles that we have to abide by. And when you enter into that kind of agreement, even though it's for pro bono or whatever, you're compromising your independence as a law firm. I'm not saying law firms can't, they can be as political as they want, but you're letting the government have a say in what you do as a private law firm. And, look at these pro bono arrangements, right? It's like, a given firm will provide up to $10 million of pro bono approved by the administration. I asked rhetorically, I don't actually know the answer. How does this work? What if you're one of these firms that settled and you want to do a piece of pro bono that counts against your 10 million? Is there someone in the White House you have to call and go, hey, so we would like to represent such and such. Can that count? And are you keeping a ledger? Where are we? Do we still owe you 8.5 million? Like, how is this actually working, if at all? It may be that there's no actual enforcement, but I think the blame in the first place falls on Trump for even doing this. I think it's outrageous. And if you read those orders, the executive orders, there's not even any pretext or pretense about it. It just says we're targeting this firm because they hired Robert Mueller and he came after the president. We're targeting this firm because they represented Hillary Clinton. And I think there's a second layer of fault to lay at the feet of those law firms. And I don't think they'll ultimately. I think ultimately the firms that have settled will regret having done that.
Yeah, and there was another article, kind of a comprehensive article in the New York Times about things going on at the Department of Justice, chronologically from firing people who worked on the
Oh
Trump
gosh.
case to
Yep.
all these things. And one particular quote in that article really struck me. One of the people who was fired was Liz Oyer, the pardon attorney. And after she was fired, she wanted to get an attorney to represent herself. And so the
Uh-huh.
quote in the article, she said, I needed a lawyer. I spent the entire weekend calling all of the lawyers that I know at law firms around DC. Everybody
Right.
I talked to was saying, thank you so much for what you're doing. We'll do whatever we can behind the scenes to support you. But
But
nobody actually wanted to sit behind me at a congressional hearing. Nobody wanted to put their name on a letter to
right.
Todd Blanche. That's a pretty damning indictment of the legal profession, don't you think? That's a quote.
Yes. Yes. And what's so insidious about these orders is they hit the firms where it hurts. They know that these firms are client driven and profit driven. And that's not, I don't say that in a judgmental way. That's what they are. They're corporate entities. And think about it from the point of view. The example I always get is, let's say you're the general counsel of Lockheed Martin, right? A massive defense contractor where I have no idea, but I would assume 90 or 100, some massive percent of their revenues comes from federal government contracts, right? You're building airplanes and whatever, bombs, whatever else. If you need a law firm to represent you, and there's 15 law firms on the president's shit list, but then there's another 50 or 35, let's say, super elite firms, why on earth would you rationally go to one of the firms who are on the bad list when you could just tiptoe down the lane, down, K Street in DC or, up Fifth Avenue in New York, go to one that's not induced the president's ire and hire them and get really good elite legal representation. And so the fear here is with these law firms is they want to do the right thing, but they don't want to risk their client base. They don't want to risk being shut out by the administration. And so I think that's why Liz Oyer said, but look, there are firms that absolutely deserve credit that have stood up and stood strong. There are several firms. I will say I started my career at Covington and Burling. They were one of the firms listed in one of the EOs, and they have not settled. There's further firms who've taken Trump to court. They've all won, by the way. Everyone who's challenged Trump on these has won and will continue to win. So it's funny because the furor around these law firm cases has really just receded. And I don't know what the current status is. Like, I don't know whether they're actually doing this pro bono work or not. And I don't know whether this will continue or not. But it is truly insidious.
Yeah. Well, I did want to save some time for your book. Your book is When You Come at the King, and
I
it's
put a link
about
in there.
independent counsels and special counsels. And what made you write this book?
This is my third book. I wasn't planning to write a third one this quickly. It's a combination of two things. So one, I started in the media in 2018, the summer when Mueller was really at its peak. because of that, because they needed. I had just left the AG's office. They needed prosecutors on air all day, and I like doing this. And so I've been involved in covering, and I realized there's a real historical blip there where we had 5 special counsel investigations in a 6-year stretch or so, from Mueller to Durham to Hunter Biden to Joe Biden to Jack Smith and Donald Trump. And then I also was sort of the inspiration for this book, the structure came from George Stephanopoulos' book about the Situation Room. And what he does is he says, let me take this important governmental institution, in his case, the Situation Room, and each chapter will be a major time it was used. So the Sit Room book is about Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and on through Vietnam and 9/11 and COVID, whatever. And I thought, ooh, that would be a really good structure for a book about the history of, the names have changed over the years, but independent counsel. So Watergate, Iran-Contra, Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, that whole thing, on through Pat Fitzgerald and Scooter Libby, up through the modern cases. And you get this real historical thread. In the book, I speak on the record with 30, I think the final number is 36 or 37 people who, on record, there's no anonymous anything. Everyone puts their name. People who were involved in these cases. I speak with the defense lawyers for Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Bill Clinton. I speak with prosecutors from virtually every one of these teams. I speak with people who were prosecuted. I speak with congressional advisors, White House advisors. And you really, the book, the best part of the book is the storytelling, which is most of the book. It's not a legalistic book. And there's so many stories that I love. I'll give you one that just sort of, I think maybe makes a nice point consistent with what we're talking about. So I talked to 2 people who were Watergate prosecutors, Jill Wine-Banks, who was 30 at the time, and Jim Quarles, who was 26 at the time. They were young prosecutors on Archibald Cox's team. Now they're, in their late 70s and 80s. Both sharp as tacks, both wonderful. In fact, Quarles was both on the Watergate team and Robert Mueller's team 45 years later. And Quarles has a great quote in the book. He said, I was too young for Watergate and too old for Mueller. So they both give the story firsthand of what it was like on the Sunday morning after the Saturday Night Massacre, right? So we all know the Saturday Night Massacre. They're getting too close. Nixon decides, I want to get rid of Archibald Cox, this sort of patrician, revered figure. He had been a Harvard law professor. A guy wore a bow tie everywhere. They all worshipped him. And Elliot Richardson, who was the AG, refuses to do the firing and resigns. William Ruckelshaus, who was the deputy AG, same thing, refuses to do the firing and resigns. Robert Bork comes in and does the firing. I want to go back to Bork in a minute. And so Jill Wine-Banks told me this great story. She said, I was working 6.5 days a week. I couldn't get a day off, but it was a late Saturday in October. I had a family wedding in New York. I got permission. I took a day off. I went to this wedding. I came back at midnight, and the desk clerk, the hotel desk clerk, hands me one of those notes, like in the old days, like a message, a handwritten message that says, the office has been seized. Return to DC immediately. So first thing Sunday morning, she hustles back down to DC, and they both told me, there's points in the book where people's memories conflict. But here it's very consistent. And both Jim and Jill told me, we didn't know what the hell had happened to us. We knew that, Richardson and Ruckelshaus and Cox were gone, but we didn't know if we'd all been fired. In fact, the New York Times erroneously reported that the whole team had been dispatched. And they said there was actual yellow police tape on our desks. We didn't know what to do. And so they found a conference room, the young prosecutors, and they were debating, what do we do? Do we resign in protest? Do we keep going? Do we make a public statement? And at that point, Archibald Cox comes into the room. Now, I assume they had let him back in to clean out his desk or something. Nowadays, they would never let you back in, right? They would just change your passcode and you never. But this is the 70s. And Cox comes into the room with them and says, do not give him, Nixon, do not give him what he wants. You stay here and you finish the job. And they did that. And as bad as Nixon's conduct was, he understood that there needed to be, politically, forget about anything else, he just politically didn't have the capital to completely kill this investigation. And in fact, I want to go back to Bork. Bork is commonly seen as an enemy, as a villain, right? As the bad guy. The guy, when everyone else resigned in protest, Bork was the toady who came in and did Nixon's bidding. I argue in the book that is an absolutely wrong reading of history, because years later, both Elliot Richardson and William Ruckelshaus, heroes, heroic men, served in combat, just exemplary human beings, people I deeply admire. Both of them said years later, that they asked Bork, they begged Bork as they were quitting, you have to come in and you have to do what Nixon's saying. Because at the time, the line of succession in DOJ only went three deep. There was no one, Bork was Solicitor General. There was nobody after the Solicitor General. And they understood. Richardson said, he died several years ago, but he said publicly, we did our research. We concluded that, like it or not, the president did have the authority to fire the independent prosecutor. And so somebody had to do it, or else so we asked Bork to do it, basically as a tourniquet. He did it. He was sort of unwitting. He had no involvement in Watergate. They may have soft pedaled the amount of political damage, but they got to be the heroes for all time, the heroes of the massacre, and he's the bad guy. But they asked him to, and he did the right thing. If he had not done it, the firings would have continued indefinitely. And so I think, look, there's other things to be critical of for Robert Bork. His judicial philosophy was borderline racist, if not worse than that. There are valid criticisms of Robert Bork, but I think it's wrong to cast him. I think it's overly simplistic and wrong to cast him as a villain of Watergate. And by the way, let me add, Bork was one of the key figures who put political pressure on Nixon, saying, now that you've done all these firings, you have to reappoint a new special prosecutor, which he did. And we got Leon Jaworski, who was super aggressive and served the subpoena and won the Supreme Court decision and got the tapes. And then Nixon resigned. So ultimately, if not for Bork, I don't believe Leon Jaworski ever becomes the special counsel. So I think we need to revise our view of history there a little bit.
We're running up against the hour, but if you have time, Elie, we could go a few minutes over because there's so much to talk about. I think your book is so incredible
Sure.
with all those behind the scenes stories you have. One, you got the story behind the story, and that has not really been presented before. It's a very readable book, and it really is a lot of storytelling. One quote in the book that I found interesting is probably a friend, at least friend or colleague of both of ours, Rod Rosenstein, who was Deputy Attorney General in the first Trump
I
administration.
know what you're going to say. The rules are made for the hard cases.
Yes, he says every special counsel starts with a
Oh,
sterling reputation, but no one finishes up that way. Do you agree with that?
oh gosh, yes. And Bob Ray, who ended up replacing Ken Starr, said something similar. He said, everyone's in favor of the idea of a special counsel until one is pointed at them. Yeah, I think it's really hard, especially given how divided we are now. I mean, let's just think through recent history. Who's been special counsel? Okay, Jack Smith, we're seeing this play out right now. Very sharp division of opinion on him. Uh, Mueller, a little bit of a mixed record. I think since probably, Ken Starr certainly has a mixed record at best. I think it's hard to say. I think it's a very difficult job to take. I respect the people who do take it. I thought you were going to say Rosenstein had a really good quote where he said the rules are made for the hard cases. He's critical of Jim Comey for the way, I used the Hillary Clinton email
Yeah.
investigation 2016, and the way Jim Comey and Loretta Lynch mishandled it as a perfect example of why the special counsel rules are highly imperfect. But as I argue in the end of the book, they're the worst solution. I'm paraphrasing the famous Winston Churchill quote. They're the worst possible solution except for all the others. And when you have no rules on the book, you end up with, I won't recap the whole thing, but Loretta Lynch decided not to appoint special counsel. Instead, she said, I'm going to just defer to Jim Comey. Well, we all know what happened there. Jim Comey ran wild, overstepped his authority, basically usurped the chain of command at DOJ, and ended up probably, we don't know for sure, but probably swinging the 2016 election. So Rosenstein was very critical of Comey. They're infamously, not fans of one another. Comey declined to speak with me for the book, but Rosenstein made a good point. He said, look, anyone can sort of make up the rules to suit them, but the reason we have the rules is for when you have a hard case like this. So we have some guidance as to how things work.
Yeah, and just to reacquaint our audience with the facts, Loretta Lynch, who was then Attorney General, had a brief conversation on the tarmac at an airport with Bill Clinton, and there were
Yeah,
calls for her to recuse herself. And
but
as
but
you,
it's actually a little more than that, because put aside the tarmac meeting, there was already a conflict of interest because they're investigating the Democratic frontrunner who had been a cabinet member in that Obama administration. She had been Secretary of State. It was clearly going to be Hillary versus eventually Trump. I even argue right there. That's enough. That's a conflict of interest, or at least the appearance of a conflict of interest. Then the tarmac meeting happens, which even if all they did was discuss grandparents and youth soccer, as they both claimed, I believe them. Loretta Lynch herself said a few weeks later that her tarmac meeting with Bill Clinton, and I quote Loretta Lynch, cast a shadow. That's her word on the case. And I argue in the book at that point she had two good options. One, recuse herself and let Sally Yates, her very able deputy, take over, or two, appoint special counsel. Instead, she invents this ridiculous half measure where she says, I'm not going to recuse myself, but what I'm going to do is defer to the FBI. You don't defer. The FBI, look, you work hand in hand with the FBI, but the ultimate charging decision you can't give to especially Jim Comey. I mean, that's like, that's like who else is going to run matter with power than Jim Comey? And that's what he does. And there's actually a galling moment when Comey has called a national press conference for that afternoon, 2 p.m., I think. After he's already called the press conference, he tells Loretta Lynch and Sally Yates, I've called the press conference. Right. And they say, well, what will you be announcing? And he says, my findings on the Clinton case. And they say, well, what are your findings? And he says, I won't tell you. You'll hear. They should have fired his ass on the spot. That is insubordination to do that. Yeah. But they didn't. They didn't do their jobs right. And Jim Comey certainly didn't do his either. And look where it led.
Yeah, well, to the most recent special counsel, Jack Smith, what do you think? Because his case kind of ended with a whimper because Trump got reelected. But what are your thoughts on the handling of that case and how it's played out?
I think Jack Smith was put in an impossible situation. The first line of that chapter is Jack Smith never had a chance. The fact that Merrick Garland waited till November of 2022, almost 2 full years, to appoint Jack Smith. My second book, which I wrote at that time, I said, it's already too late, everybody. There's no way he's going to get these cases investigated, indicted, deal with the obvious lingering immunity issue, which I flagged in my last book before the immunity decision. And there's no way he's going to get these cases tried before the 2024 election. And sure enough, that's what ended up happening. I'm also, look, I think Jack Smith is handled with kid gloves by the media. He's seen look, I think he's unfairly vilified by the right and undeservedly deified by the left. I don't think he was some hyper partisan pro Kamala Harris, anti-Trump vigilante, but there's a lot to criticize about Jack Smith. And look, this is a guy who the 4 biggest cases he ever handled before this one were all rejected by judges or juries for overcharging or for commentary or conduct that violated a defendant's constitutional rights. Why would you choose that guy for this? Of all the able prosecutors, then I think it's hard to argue that Jack Smith was not political because he bent over backwards to try to get Trump tried before the 2024 election. He never admitted. It was obvious he was trying to do that. Now, I know people, I'm sure some of the audience members' heads are exploding right now saying, but he was right. He should have been trying to try Donald Trump before the 2024 election. I'll hear you on that. But you can't tell me he wasn't trying to expedite this case because of the election. And in so doing, that's inherently political. I'll give you 2 other quick examples. He tried to muzzle Donald Trump in a way that violated Trump's First Amendment rights. And that's not me talking. That's Judge Chutkan talking. Smith wanted a gag order that was this broad. Judge Chutkan said, no, that's too much. It got cut down to this. And then the circuit said, that's unconstitutional. I cut it down to this. The other thing is there was a moment that to me was really telling. When the case came back to the district court in October of 2024, a month and change before the election, they had to get back to motions. Now, how do motions work? Everyone on this call who's ever been a practitioner knows the defense makes its motions and then the prosecution responds, right? There's almost no such thing as prosecution motions other than motions in limine. The problem for Jack Smith was there was only time for one of those because the election was a month away. And so the way it would have naturally played out is Trump would have put in his motions shortly before, right after the election, that Jack Smith wouldn't have got to have his say. Jack Smith asked the court to reverse the rules, to let him go first, and for him to file a quadruple length brief. And Judge Chutkan, who basically did everything Jack Smith wanted, even said this is procedurally irregular, then let him do it. And then he filed a 140-page missive 3 weeks before the election. I mean, that to me was a dead giveaway of where this guy's head was at. He knew he had lost. He knew he was not going to be able to try his cases, and he took a cheap shot on his way out the office, on his way out, so he could maybe land a little bit of a damaging blow 3 weeks before the election. So I think Jack Smith was highly imperfect. I wish the left would stop treating this guy as if everything he did was spun gold, and as if because he gets up and declares that he had no political motives, oh, see? I mean, Pam Bondi will tell you she has no political motives. Do you accept that at face value? What if Todd Blanche and Pam Bondi, the four biggest cases they ever did before they got in office, all had been rejected by liberal judges? Ruth Bader Ginsburg rejected one of his cases for being overcharged and unconstitutional and violative of the defendant's rights. Would we ever stop talking about that if it was Pam Bondi or Todd Blanche? No, we wouldn't. Do you ever hear that with respect to Jack Smith? Nope, he's a golden god. So sorry, I went on a little bender there, but I think there's real bias in the way Jack Smith has been
Yeah,
covered by
yeah.
many in the media.
Another book, which I'm sure you've probably read, suggests because if the goal of Jack Smith, as you say, and he wasn't as transparent about it, was to try those cases before the election. If he made one mistake, if that was his goal, was bringing the classified documents case in Florida rather than the District of Columbia, and he ended up getting Judge Eileen Cannon, who slow walked that case. Do you agree?
Yeah, he would not have been able to try that case no matter who he got, because he still would have had the immunity argument. It still would have taken the same. But I will say, people who blame Jack Smith, and I've seen a lot of liberals angry that he chose to bring it in Florida rather than DC, you're giving yourself away. Because what you're saying there is Jack Smith should have judge shopped for advantage, right? He did that. He actually did the right thing by bringing this in Florida, because way more of the conduct, 98% of the conduct, happened in Florida. He definitely had venue in Florida. He could have charged it in DC. He would have had a better chance of convicting, and he would have probably had a better judge for him. But he might have lost on venue. There's a good argument that there's no venue in DC. And so if he was maybe reverse judge shopping, he would have gone in DC, but he did the right thing. And if you're saying, oh, I wish he would have charged in Florida, then you're giving yourself away, that you are okay with a prosecutor bending the ordinary rules and judge shopping because it would have been better politically or something like that. So, I think while Judge Cannon certainly comes in for a lot of fair criticism, there's not a but for there. He could have been in front of, the most anti-Trump judge on the planet in Florida. He was in front of a judge who was certainly not a fan of his in DC, and Judge Chutkan. But it forces beyond the control of any district court judge. The Supreme Court, the immunity issue was definitely had to go to the Supreme Court no matter what. And then just the timing of that and all that, that's what prevented the case from being tried. And the laws of physics, like you can't. I mean, this is another fault with Jack Smith. He demanded a trial date of Donald Trump 4 months after the indictment. An average case in D.C., you get 2 years to prep. He thought Donald Trump. Let me ask every lawyer on this call: do you think you could adequately represent your defendant and do a constitutionally proper defense of your client if you were given 4 months to prepare for trial in a case with 13 million pages of documents and with dozens of high-profile witnesses who had written books and given interviews and been high-ranking government officials that you needed to prepare for? There's no way. There's not a good faith lawyer out there on the planet who will tell you that he could properly protect his client's constitutional rights in 4 months. Yet Jack Smith insisted on that for Donald Trump.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you wrote this whole book, and like I said, I recommend it to everyone. It's got a lot of stuff that has never really been published before, but kind of from just a citizen sense, I feel like Watergate, the counsel there, that really did make changes. People took that seriously, and it seems like there's a lot of almost special counsel fatigue since then.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are, like you're kind of
Well,
closing on the book and this
yeah.
use of special counsels?
At the end of the book, I sort of suggest that it is time to revamp the rules, right? Historically, we've done this every 20, 25 years or so. We're due, because currently we're operating off the 1999 regulations. I won't detail it, but I sort of lay out what I think a better system would look like. But my end plea is, this goes back to where we started, Mary. What we are seeing now is fundamentally different from anything we've seen in our history. A president who is completely and openly politicized and weaponized DOJ. And whoever becomes president next, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, is going to find that a lot of guardrails have been kicked down. Not just the independence of DOJ, not just special counsel, but ethics restrictions, inspectors general, limits on private profiteering activity, nepotism, you name it. And, you know, no president in their heart of hearts really likes those things, right? Like what president, no president, trust me, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, name your Joe Biden, did not enjoy being investigated. However, they've all understood that some level of tolerance for these institutions is essential. And so it's going to be tempting for the next president to leave those guardrails on the ground in tatters where they are right now. But this one, meaning, well, these two, an independent Justice Department and some mechanism of inward facing high level investigation, have to be preserved or restored. It's just too important to allow this to become to allow it to become a foregone conclusion that, well, all DOJs are just going to do whatever is best for their own president and whatever satisfies his political needs. That's a really bad place if that's where we end up.
Well, my final couple questions, just to kind of wrap us all up.
Yeah.
One came from the audience. With all of this, the question was, given all this, what could a lawyer or even an average citizen do? And then my kind of final questions to you are, what gives you hope for the future, given that these guardrails are down now, and how
Yep.
can the Justice Department be restored? So just
Yeah,
to
I mean,
get
I guess I would go back. I'll take the middle of those questions. You know, how can the Justice Department be restored is sort of in the book. I mean, I don't have like a magic, I don't purport to have a magic solution. One of the points that I make in the book, though, is the rules are important, the regs are important, very important. But the people are just as important, if not more so. I mean, and I give examples. I say, look, you could be a prosecutor who faithfully stays in your lane, as we've seen. Robert Hur stayed in his lane. Jack Smith certainly stayed in his lane. Or you can go on a wild goose chase like Ken Starr, right? There are presidents who have been very tolerant of this kind of investigation. When George W. Bush's administration was being investigated by Pat Fitzgerald, it was very disruptive. Scooter Libby got indicted. Karl Rove, I detail in the book, was a hair's breadth away from being indicted. The only public comments George W. Bush ever made about Pat Fitzgerald, the prosecutor, was, he's a very thorough guy. Let him do his job. If there's criminals in my administration, I want to know it. Contrast that with, certainly with Nixon, but Donald Trump, night and day. So there's examples throughout the book of people who've abided by these principles and who have not abided by these principles. So the people are really important. I don't think we are are facing the end of democracy at this moment. I do have faith in our guardrails and our systems. They're definitely not perfect. But again, even if you look at this Trump era, it's been a tumultuous year. A lot of really destructive things have happened, but our system is still intact. Courts are reining in some of the abuses. Congress isn't, but if you have a problem with that, start winning elections. I mean, so I don't think this is the end of our system, but I think this is a stress test. I think we will survive and endure, but it takes effort and it takes conscious attention. It's not just going to happen automatically.
Oh, and you had mentioned George W. Bush, and I don't recall if you had mentioned this in the book, but I remember at the time I had heard that one of the very last things Vice President Cheney asked George W. Bush was to pardon Scooter
Libby.
Libby before the end of the administration, and he refused to do it.
This was a point of longstanding contention between them because Bush commuted Libby's sentence. I think it was a 30-month or 36-month sentence. Which, by the way, one of the Libby prosecutors is in this book, and he says that sentence was excessive. He said, like, I didn't even, as the prosecutor, didn't think Scooter Libby needed to do 36 months. Bush commuted it, but wouldn't pardon, and Cheney and he had it out on the last day. Cheney said something like, you don't leave a Marine on the battlefield. And that apparently impacted their relationship moving forward. I don't know if they ever reconciled, but yeah, there was a real difference of opinion there.
Well, thank you so much, Elie. We went over time. I kind of knew we would because there's so much to do, but this was such a timely and powerful and I think important conversation. And we had the most perfect person to share his thoughts with us. Thank you so much, Elie. So
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
If you enjoyed this program, go to the Task Force for American Democracy's website at www.democracy-taskforce.org and sign up for our newsletter. We will be presenting future webinars, and we hope you will join us. Our next webinar will be on February 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we will be joined by MS Now commentator Joyce Vance and her new book, Giving Up is Unforgivable. So hope you can join us, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you.